$5 million says nobody in this room can solve it. The words rolled across the grand ballroom like a spotlight sweeping over a stage, instantly silencing hundreds of conversations beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. Glasses paused halfway to waiting lips. A string quartet softened into the background. Every camera turned toward the center platform where Ethan Caldwell, the 38-year-old billionaire founder of Caldwell Quantum Systems, stood with effortless confidence, his tailored navy tuxedo as immaculate as the reputation that had made him one of America's most celebrated technology visionaries. Behind him, a towering screen displayed a web of mathematical symbols, neural network diagrams, and impossible equations that looked more like modern art than something any ordinary person could understand. This optimization model has defeated my engineers, professors from MIT, and 3 Nobel Prize nominees, Ethan said with an amused smile that barely concealed his certainty. Solve it tonight, and I'll wire $5 million before dessert is served. Laughter drifted through the room. It wasn't cruel at first. It was the comfortable laughter of powerful people enjoying a spectacle they already believed had only one ending. Investors exchanged confident smiles. Tech executives folded their arms. Television crews adjusted their lenses, eager to capture another headline celebrating the billionaire genius who loved impossible challenges almost as much as he loved proving everyone else wrong. Along the edge of the ballroom, unnoticed beneath the warm amber lights, Naomi Brooks quietly carried a polished silver tray filled with sparkling water. Her black uniform was perfectly pressed. Her name tag reflected tiny flashes of chandelier light every time she moved between the tables. She worked with practiced precision, replacing glasses before anyone realized they were empty, stepping silently around conversations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Most guests never looked directly at her. They looked through her, as though she were another elegant detail included with the expensive dinner. She had grown accustomed to that invisible role. It asked nothing from her except professionalism and silence. Ethan glanced across the audience again before pointing casually toward the glowing equation behind him. Take your time, he joked. Actually, don't. You'd need another lifetime. More laughter erupted, louder this time, feeding on itself until confidence became entertainment. One venture capitalist leaned toward another and whispered that $5 million was probably the cheapest publicity campaign Ethan had ever purchased. Nearby, a renowned AI researcher slowly lowered his tablet, already admitting defeat without speaking a word. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to certainty. The puzzle no longer represented possibility. It had become a monument to one man's brilliance. Naomi paused beside a table to refill another glass, her eyes lifting for only a heartbeat toward the impossible pattern glowing across the massive display. No one noticed the brief stillness in her expression. No one wondered why her gaze lingered just a second longer than everyone else's. They saw only a young black waitress doing exactly what she had been hired to do. But hidden beneath the quiet rhythm of service was a mind that refused to stop calculating. And while the wealthiest people in the room admired the genius standing beneath the spotlight, real genius remained almost invisible, carrying a silver tray through the crowd. Naomi Brooks had learned years ago that people often noticed uniforms long before they noticed faces. Every evening, she tied the same black apron around her waist, smoothed the same crisp sleeves, and pinned the same silver name tag above her heart before stepping into rooms where influence was measured in market value instead of character. Guests remembered the vintage of the wine she served, the brands of their watches, and the names of keynote speakers, yet almost none of them remembered hers. That had never surprised Naomi. What surprised her was how quickly intelligent people confused appearance with ability. As she moved quietly between polished marble columns and linen-covered tables, conversations floated through the ballroom like overlapping radio stations. Executives debated artificial intelligence regulations. Investors argued over billion-dollar valuations. Entrepreneurs repeated fashionable phrases about innovation and disruption. Everyone sounded brilliant until someone outside their circle spoke. Then confidence often turned into quiet dismissal. Naomi collected empty glasses with steady hands while listening without appearing to listen. Years of working in luxury hotels had taught her that the people who revealed the most were usually the ones convinced nobody important was paying attention. One guest joked that every difficult problem eventually needed another billionaire to solve it. Another laughed that genius always came dressed in expensive suits. Several nodded in agreement without questioning the assumption. Naomi simply continued arranging silverware with calm precision. She never interrupted. She never corrected anyone. She had discovered something far more valuable than winning random arguments. Invisible people hear everything. Earlier that afternoon, before the ballroom filled with cameras and tailored jackets, she had arrived almost an hour before her shift began. While other employees checked seating charts and polished crystal glasses, Naomi quietly opened a worn notebook she kept inside her locker. Its pages were filled not with grocery lists or schedules, but with equations, algorithms, and handwritten observations collected over many years. Some pages contained corrections to published research papers she had studied at the public library. Others held elegant solutions she had discovered during sleepless nights after caring for her grandmother, whose declining health had changed the course of Naomi's entire life. Long before she ever carried serving trays, she had carried dreams of graduate school, research laboratories, and classrooms where difficult questions mattered more than family bank accounts. Life had chosen another path. Hospital bills arrived faster than scholarship opportunities. Responsibility arrived before recognition. She never complained because survival rarely waited for perfect timing. Still, every equation she solved reminded her that knowledge could survive even when circumstances changed. The ballroom lights reflected across the enormous digital display as technicians adjusted its brightness for the audience. Naomi glanced toward the screen once more while replacing fresh water beside an empty chair reserved for a venture capital executive delayed by traffic. Her eyes quietly followed the structure of the optimization model from left to right, recognizing familiar patterns hidden beneath unnecessary complexity. She noticed an assumption embedded deep inside the framework that seemed strangely inefficient. Her expression did not change. She simply memorized it before continuing toward the next table. Nearby, Ethan Caldwell accepted congratulations from admirers who praised the brilliance of his challenge before anyone had attempted to solve it. Their compliments blended together with the soft music and polite applause until certainty filled the room more completely than curiosity. Nobody realized that the only person studying the problem instead of Ethan was the woman they still believed existed only to refill their glasses. One by one, the brightest minds in the ballroom stepped forward with the confidence that only years of recognition could produce. A distinguished professor from Stanford adjusted his glasses and studied the glowing equations for nearly 8 minutes before quietly lowering the digital pen without writing a single line. A celebrated software architect proposed an elegant shortcut that looked promising for less than 30 seconds before Ethan Caldwell politely pointed out the hidden flaw that unraveled the entire approach. A hedge fund analyst famous for predicting technology trends attempted to simplify the model through probability mapping, only to discover that every path led back to the same impossible bottleneck. Each attempt ended with respectful applause, thoughtful smiles, and another reminder that the challenge remained unsolved. The audience admired the failures almost as much as they admired Ethan's confidence. Every unsuccessful solution reinforced the legend they already believed. Cameras captured thoughtful expressions. Reporters scribbled fresh notes. Social media. Influencers whispered that tomorrow morning every financial headline would celebrate the billionaire who had once again demonstrated why he stood several steps ahead of everyone else in the industry. Ethan accepted each compliment with practiced humility, yet the quiet satisfaction in his eyes was impossible to miss. He had spent months refining the model, eliminating every obvious shortcut, every predictable assumption, every conventional solution. To him, this evening was not merely entertainment. It was proof that true innovation belonged to those willing to think beyond ordinary limits. Across the ballroom, Naomi Brooks continued clearing dinner plates while mentally reconstructing the optimization framework from memory. The more she replayed its structure, the more convinced she became that the problem itself was not impossibly difficult. It was simply being viewed from the wrong direction. Instead of forcing efficiency through additional variables, the model required one foundational assumption to disappear entirely. It was an approach so simple that experienced experts might overlook it precisely because they had spent decades mastering increasingly complicated methods. Naomi almost smiled before catching herself. Experience had taught her another lesson. Simplicity often sounded foolish until it worked. A nearby guest snapped his fingers politely to ask for another glass of sparkling water. Naomi thanked him with a warm smile and refilled the crystal glass before moving toward the next table. As she passed two venture capital partners, she overheard one of them say, "There is a reason nobody ever discovers the next breakthrough while carrying a serving tray." His companion chuckled softly. Talent follows opportunity. Naomi did not react. She simply continued walking, although the sentence echoed in her thoughts longer than either man could have imagined. She knew something they did not. Opportunity often followed assumptions, and assumptions were surprisingly fragile. Back on stage, Ethan folded his arms as another respected engineer admitted defeat after nearly 15 minutes of careful analysis. "Do not be discouraged," Ethan said with an easy grin. That drew another wave of laughter from the audience. If solving this were easy, it would not be worth $5 million. More applause filled the ballroom. But beneath the polished confidence and expensive celebration, something subtle had begun to shift. Naomi looked once more toward the illuminated equations, and this time the final missing connection became unmistakably clear. The answer settled into her mind with quiet certainty, not like a lightning bolt, but like the final piece of a puzzle finding the only place it had ever truly belonged. She tightened her grip on the silver tray, took one slow breath, and realized that remaining silent was no longer the hardest choice. The silence stretched just long enough for people to believe the evening was over. Guests reached for dessert menus. Reporters lowered their cameras. Several investors stood, already discussing tomorrow morning's stock market reaction, convinced they had witnessed another unforgettable demonstration of Ethan Caldwell's brilliance. Then a calm voice rose from the edge of the ballroom. "Excuse me." It was neither loud nor dramatic, yet it carried with surprising clarity through the quiet room. Heads turned almost instinctively. Naomi Brooks stood beside a service station, still holding the polished silver tray against her side. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke because nobody expected the interruption to come from her. One executive frowned with polite confusion. Another glanced toward the restaurant manager, assuming he would quickly redirect the young waitress back to her responsibilities. Ethan looked toward the voice with mild curiosity rather than irritation. "Yes?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes without challenging him. "May I try?" For one frozen second, the question seemed too unexpected for anyone to process. Then scattered laughter broke across the ballroom. A few people smiled politely, believing she was making an innocent joke. Others exchanged amused looks. One guest quietly whispered that confidence was certainly free. Another chuckled that perhaps serving dinner had become less demanding than expected. Even several camera operators smiled while adjusting their lenses toward Naomi, expecting an entertaining moment before the evening concluded. The restaurant manager hurried a few steps forward, his face tightening with concern. "Naomi," he said softly, "please come back. The guests are waiting." She turned respectfully toward him. "I will return to work in just a moment, sir." There was no anger in her voice. No pride, only quiet certainty. Ethan studied her expression for several seconds. He had spent years reading investors across negotiating tables, detecting hesitation before contracts were signed and confidence before billion-dollar acquisitions closed. What he expected to see now was nervousness. Instead, he found remarkable composure. That surprised him more than the request itself. "You understand what this challenge is?" Ethan asked. Naomi nodded. "I believe I do." Another wave of laughter drifted across the room, lighter this time, but no less dismissive. A venture capitalist folded his arms and joked that at least the audience would receive one final surprise before coffee. Someone else quietly wondered whether she had mistaken the equation for a crossword puzzle. Their comments floated through the ballroom without reaching Naomi. She had heard variations of them for years. They no longer carried enough weight to distract her. Ethan glanced toward the enormous screen and then back to Naomi. Something inside him hesitated. His logical mind insisted this was impossible. Yet another part of him, the part that had built an empire by recognizing unlikely opportunities, noticed that she had never claimed she hoped to solve it. She had simply asked to try. The distinction lingered in his thoughts. Finally, he smiled with measured courtesy and stepped aside from the center platform. "All right," he said. "The same rules apply to everyone." Gasps mixed with excited whispers as cameras immediately swung toward the stage again. Reporters lifted their microphones. Guests straightened in their seats. Nobody believed they were about to witness history. They believed they were about to watch a brief curiosity before the evening resumed. Naomi quietly placed her silver tray onto the nearest service cart, smoothed the sleeves of her uniform, and walked toward the stage with unhurried steps. Every polished shoe, every designer watch, every camera lens, and every skeptical eye followed her across the ballroom, while the glowing equation waited silently above, unchanged, unaware that the person approaching it had spent years preparing for a moment the world never imagined would arrive. Naomi stopped a few feet from the massive display, her attention fixed on the glowing network of equations while the murmurs behind her blended into a distant hum. Ethan Caldwell extended a sleek digital stylus toward her, expecting her to reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked at the screen for several quiet seconds before speaking. "May I have a regular marker instead?" The request caught everyone off guard. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You would rather use a marker?" Naomi nodded politely. "Yes, I think more clearly that way." Another ripple of laughter rolled through the ballroom. Someone joked that perhaps simplicity was part of her strategy. A television reporter quietly whispered into her microphone that the unexpected volunteer apparently preferred old-fashioned tools over cutting-edge technology. Ethan hesitated only briefly before turning toward an event assistant. Within moments, a plain black dry erase marker was placed into Naomi's hand. She thanked the assistant with a warm smile, then stepped closer to the oversized white presentation board positioned beside the digital display instead of writing directly on the interactive screen. The decision puzzled nearly everyone. If she intended to impress the room, they expected dramatic animations and complex diagrams. Instead, she uncapped the marker and drew one small circle. Nothing more. Several guests exchanged confused glances. A professor folded his arms, clearly unconvinced. Naomi continued without acknowledging the audience. She added 3 short lines connecting the circle to a second symbol before writing a single mathematical assumption that had appeared almost unnoticed near the center of Ethan's original model. She paused, studying it quietly. "This is where everyone begins," she said gently. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as though explaining an idea to a classroom rather than addressing some of the most influential people in American technology. "But I do not think this is where the problem actually starts." Ethan watched silently. His expression remained composed, although curiosity had begun replacing amusement. Naomi drew one clean line through the assumption. Gasps spread softly across the ballroom. One engineer immediately shook his head. "You cannot remove that," he whispered under his breath. Another researcher leaned forward in his chair, suddenly paying much closer attention. Naomi continued writing with slow confidence. Every symbol flowed naturally into the next. There were no frantic corrections, no hesitation, no unnecessary calculations. Instead of adding more complexity, she removed it. One variable disappeared. Then another dependency dissolved. Equations that had filled multiple branches of the original model collapsed into an elegant sequence so concise that several people frowned, convinced they must have missed something important. Ethan took one slow step closer without realizing he had moved. His eyes followed every line Naomi wrote. For the first time that evening, he was no longer evaluating a contestant. He was trying to understand her reasoning before she reached the conclusion. The ballroom grew remarkably still. Even the waitstaff paused discreetly along the walls. Camera operators stopped whispering instructions to one another. The clicking of expensive watches against crystal glasses disappeared completely. Naomi never hurried. She capped the marker for a moment, stepped back, and quietly studied the board from a distance of several feet. Then she uncapped it once more and added one final equation beneath everything else. It occupied less than a single line. Nothing about it looked extraordinary. Yet the simplicity of it seemed almost impossible after the overwhelming complexity that had filled the giant display only minutes earlier. Naomi lowered the marker to her side and looked toward Ethan with the same quiet composure she had shown since leaving the service floor. "I believe the optimization works if the system stops protecting the assumption that never needed protection in the first place," she said. No applause followed. No laughter remained. Only a silence so complete that every person in the ballroom suddenly realized they were witnessing something none of them had expected. For several long seconds, Ethan Caldwell said nothing. His eyes moved slowly across the board, retracing every line Naomi Brooks had written, comparing her elegant sequence with the far more complicated architecture glowing behind her on the massive display. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something much rarer. Genuine curiosity. He stepped closer until he stood only a few feet from the whiteboard, folded his arms, and quietly followed her logic from beginning to end. Once, then again. Each time he reached the final equation, the same conclusion confronted him. She had not solved the problem by discovering a hidden formula. She had solved it by refusing to accept the assumption everyone else had treated as untouchable. One of Ethan's senior engineers stood from his table and approached the stage without waiting for permission. He studied the equations with growing intensity before pulling a notebook from his jacket pocket and rapidly checking several calculations by hand. Another researcher joined him, then another. Within moments, a small circle of respected experts surrounded the board, speaking only in short technical observations that became quieter with every passing minute. The confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier had vanished. It had been replaced by careful analysis. Every person searching for an error reached the same uncomfortable destination. They could not find one. Naomi remained where she was, the marker still resting loosely in her hand. She did not interrupt the discussion or defend her work. She simply waited. She understood that remarkable ideas rarely earned immediate acceptance. They first demanded careful examination. Across the ballroom, conversations had stopped completely. Investors who had spent the evening checking market reports now watched the stage without glancing at their phones. Journalists lowered their microphones because there was nothing left to predict. Even the musicians quietly rested their instruments, sensing that something far more memorable than the evening's entertainment was unfolding before them. Ethan finally reached for the digital control panel beside the enormous display. Without saying a word, he entered Naomi's revised framework into the simulation software connected to the original optimization model. The giant screen flickered as millions of calculations began running across the processors. Rows of numbers updated faster than the eye could follow. Complex graphs shifted. Performance indicators recalculated. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Seconds felt unusually long. Then the simulation finished. A green confirmation banner appeared across the screen, followed by a dramatic increase in system efficiency that exceeded every previous benchmark Ethan's team had achieved. Several engineers stared at the results in complete disbelief. One quietly removed his glasses and checked the numbers again. Another slowly smiled before shaking his head in amazement. The improvement was not marginal. It was transformative. Naomi's single adjustment had simplified months of research into one clear insight that every expert in the room had overlooked. Ethan looked from the screen to the whiteboard and finally toward Naomi. The expression on his face no longer resembled the confident smile that had opened the evening. It reflected respect earned through undeniable evidence. He realized that the greatest surprise had not been the solution itself. It had been the identity of the person who found it. The room remained perfectly still, not because people lacked words, but because every assumption they had carried into the ballroom had quietly collapsed at the same moment, leaving only one undeniable truth standing beneath the lights. Genius had never asked for permission to be recognized. It had simply waited for someone to notice it. The first sound to break the silence was not applause. It was the quiet scrape of a chair as one of Ethan Caldwell's senior engineers slowly stood to his feet, still staring at the glowing simulation results as though they might suddenly change. They did not. The numbers remained exactly where Naomi Brooks had placed them. Processing efficiency had climbed beyond every previous projection. Resource consumption had dropped dramatically. The impossible challenge that had humbled renowned researchers only minutes earlier had been transformed into an elegant solution by the woman many guests had mistaken for part of the evening's background. One by one, more engineers approached the stage. None of them spoke immediately. They reviewed Naomi's equations again, comparing every line against Ethan's original framework. Their expressions shifted in the same sequence. Skepticism became curiosity. Curiosity became concentration. Concentration became quiet admiration. Finally, One gray-haired scientist looked toward Ethan and gave a slow, unmistakable nod. "It is correct," he said. His voice carried clearly through the ballroom because there was no other sound competing with it. Another researcher added, "Not only correct, it is more efficient than anything we tested." A third expert smiled with visible disbelief. "We kept solving the wrong problem because we never questioned the first assumption." The words settled over the audience like a wave. Guests who had laughed only moments before exchanged uncertain glances. Several lowered their eyes, suddenly remembering the comments they had made when Naomi first stepped onto the stage. The venture capitalist who had joked about the serving tray quietly folded his hands together without saying another word. The television reporter who had expected a humorous interruption now motioned for her camera operator to keep recording every second. This story had changed completely. Ethan remained near the whiteboard, his attention fixed on the elegant simplicity of Naomi's solution. Throughout his career, he had built companies by recognizing patterns others overlooked. He had invested in young founders before the world believed in them. He had trusted impossible ideas often enough to become one of the wealthiest innovators in the country. Yet tonight he had overlooked the most remarkable mind in the room because it had arrived wearing a name tag instead of a tailored suit. That realization weighed more heavily than losing any intellectual challenge ever could. Naomi still held the plain black marker, standing with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the evening. There was no celebration in her expression, no triumph. She did not scan the audience searching for approval because approval had never been the reason she walked onto the stage. She had simply answered a question with the truth she saw. The ballroom remained suspended between disbelief and admiration until an elderly mathematics professor, respected by nearly everyone present, slowly began clapping. The sound echoed alone for a brief moment before another pair of hands joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across every table until the entire ballroom rose to its feet. It was not the loud, excited applause reserved for entertainment. It carried something deeper. Respect. Naomi looked across the room, almost surprised by the standing ovation, then offered a small, grateful smile before lowering her eyes once again. Ethan joined the applause without hesitation. For the first time that evening, he was not applauding an achievement measured in dollars, patents, or market value. He was honoring the quiet brilliance that had been standing in plain sight all along, waiting for a room full of accomplished people to finally recognize that wisdom does not ask where someone works before revealing what someone knows. As the applause gradually faded, Ethan Caldwell raised one hand, asking the room for a moment of quiet. This time, people listened without hesitation. He turned toward Naomi Brooks, no longer seeing the uniform that had defined her in everyone else's eyes only minutes earlier. "There is something I need to ask," he said with complete sincerity. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Naomi remained silent for a brief moment, not because she was searching for an impressive answer, but because the truth had never sounded extraordinary to her. "I studied whenever I could," she replied. "Libraries stayed open after my shifts ended. Research papers were available if I was willing to spend enough nights reading them. I never stopped learning, even when life asked me to stop studying." The ballroom grew quiet once again. Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. "You attended graduate school?" Naomi offered a small smile. "I was accepted into one. I never made it there." No bitterness colored her voice. She spoke with the calm acceptance of someone who had already made peace with difficult choices. "My grandmother became seriously ill during my final year of college. She was the person who raised me. Medical bills replaced tuition. Taking care of family became more important than chasing another degree." Several guests lowered their eyes. The explanation carried no dramatic performance, only quiet honesty. Naomi continued, "During the day, I worked wherever I could. At night, I kept studying because learning did not require permission. It only required time." One of the professors standing near the stage asked gently, "Did you publish any of your work?" Naomi shook her head. "No, most of it stayed inside notebooks." She smiled modestly. "Sometimes solving a problem simply helps me understand the world better. Not every answer needs an audience." The simplicity of that sentence lingered throughout the ballroom. Ethan found himself reflecting on the countless presentations, interviews, and conferences where success was measured by visibility. Standing before him was someone who had pursued knowledge without applause, recognition, or financial reward. She had continued learning because she loved understanding difficult ideas. That realization humbled him more than the mathematical solution ever could. He slowly looked around the room at the investors, executives, researchers, and journalists who had gathered to celebrate innovation. Tonight, he said, we all witnessed something much bigger than an equation. His voice remained steady, but noticeably softer than before. We witnessed how easily intelligence can be overlooked when we allow appearances to make decisions before evidence does. No one disagreed. Earlier assumptions now felt embarrassingly small beside the truth standing on the stage. Ethan turned back toward Naomi. I built my career believing I could recognize talent, he admitted. Tonight I realized I almost failed the simplest test of all. I looked at a uniform before I looked at a person. Naomi met his eyes with quiet kindness rather than satisfaction. She understood that genuine humility often arrived through uncomfortable moments. It did not need to be punished. It needed to be accepted. Across the ballroom, people who had entered the evening expecting another celebration of wealth and prestige found themselves reconsidering conversations they had held throughout their own careers. Some remembered overlooked coworkers. Others thought about job applicants dismissed too quickly or strangers judged too easily. The room had changed in a way no business presentation ever could. Long after the equations would be forgotten, one lesson would remain impossible to ignore. Extraordinary ability does not announce itself through titles, clothing, or status. It reveals itself only when someone has the wisdom to look beyond all three. The ballroom remained quiet long after the applause ended, as though no one wanted to be the first to break the moment. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Instead of pulling out another prepared speech or announcing another challenge, he removed his personal business card and held it toward Naomi Brooks with both hands. I came here expecting to discover the next great breakthrough, he said. I did not realize I would first have to discover my own blind spot. Naomi looked at the card for a moment before accepting it with a grateful smile. Ethan continued, I would like to offer you a position at Caldwell Quantum Systems. Not because of what happened tonight alone, but because extraordinary thinking belongs where it can continue to grow. The audience watched closely, expecting an immediate acceptance. $5 million, a prestigious career, and recognition beyond anything Naomi had imagined seemed to be waiting only for a single word. Instead, she paused thoughtfully before answering. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you probably realize. But before I decide where I work next, I hope something else changes first. Ethan nodded. What is that? Naomi slowly looked across the ballroom, meeting the eyes of people who had barely noticed her only an hour earlier. I hope the next person wearing a uniform does not have to solve an impossible problem before someone believes they deserve to be heard. Her words settled gently over the room. No one interrupted because there was nothing left to argue. She continued, talent is everywhere. Opportunity is not. Sometimes the difference between success and silence is simply whether someone chooses to listen before they judge. Several guests quietly lowered their heads. Others exchanged thoughtful glances with colleagues sitting beside them. The lesson had grown far beyond mathematics, technology, or business. It had become deeply personal. Ethan smiled, not with the confidence that had defined him earlier that evening, but with the humility that comes from learning something impossible to ignore. Then let tonight be the beginning, he replied. Not only for your future, but for ours as well. He turned toward his leadership team. Starting tomorrow, our internship and hiring programs will include blind evaluations during the first stage of every technical assessment. No names, no photographs, no job titles, only ideas. The announcement was met with sincere applause, not because it was dramatic, but because it reflected genuine change. Naomi's quiet courage had accomplished something larger than solving a difficult equation. It had challenged an entire room to rethink the way it recognized human potential. As the evening finally drew to a close, guests left the ballroom carrying more than business cards and investment opportunities. They carried a question that lingered far longer than any headline ever could. How many remarkable people had they walked past simply because they never looked closely enough? Naomi returned to the service station, picked up the same polished silver tray she had set aside earlier, and smiled warmly at a fellow server who congratulated her with quiet excitement. The tray felt no lighter than before, yet somehow everything had changed. She had not entered the ballroom searching for recognition. She had entered simply prepared to do her job with dignity. The world changed only because truth had finally been given a chance to speak. Wealth can open doors. Power can command attention. But neither can replace the wisdom to recognize brilliance hidden behind ordinary circumstances. The greatest minds do not always stand beneath the brightest lights. Sometimes they are already in the room, patiently waiting for someone to see the person before seeing the uniform.